So we're going to begin Ecclesiastes 12 with a little bit of a review this morning and going all the way back to Ecclesiastes chapter 1. But the title of this study is the Epilogue. It's the ending, the conclusion. And we begin studying Ecclesiastes the first Sunday of February. And so we are now at the end. We'll have one more week and of our study here. We're only going to cover about 5 verses today. So the title, the Epilogue, Remember Thy Creator. And so I wanted to go back and remind you, as Solomon is writing, that he begins addressing himself not as the son of King David, but he really identifies himself as the preacher. In fact, Ecclesiastes chapter 1 and verses 1 and 2, the words of the preacher. And then he says the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Preacher could be the teacher, the proclaimer, and so he's writing these words for the enrichment of others. And of course he goes on in verse 2, he's an old man now, and he writes, "Vanity of vanities, saith the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity." Empty, 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 empty is ultimately the conclusion that Solomon has drawn. But I would remind you that Solomon is near the end of his life, and sadly, in the last years of his life, maybe the last 20 years or so of his life, he has really in many ways lived like a heathen man. And you're going to see he had many wives, and those wives turned his heart away from God. Now, in Ecclesiastes 12, which is where you should be, in Ecclesiastes 12, he now is coming to the conclusion of the study of the book of Ecclesiastes, and he returns to the same thought with which he began. Ecclesiastes 12, verse 8, 9, and 10. "Vanity of vanities, saith the preacher, all is vanity. And moreover, because the preacher was wise." That's interesting. He's learned something from life. It's better to, you might begin your life as a young fool, and you might even end up being an old fool, but it's certainly a better thing to end your life as a wise man. And so Solomon writes in verse 9, "Because the preacher was wise, he still taught the people knowledge, yea, he gave good heed and sought out and set in order many proverbs." So what is he doing? He's reflecting on the past. So he's going back and he's remembering the things that he had taught the people over the years. And apparently, as he had worked his way through the writings in Ecclesiastes, he finally comes back to, in many ways, who he was. I'll remind you, starting in about Ecclesiastes chapter 8, Solomon began writing in Proverbs again. Before chapter 8, it was doom, despair, and agony on me. But something happened around chapter 8, and he begins to write Proverbs again, wise sayings. And so we're going to look at some of those today. And then in verse 10, finally, the preacher sought to find out acceptable words, and that which was written upright, even the words of truth. So go before chapter 8, doom and despair. Now in chapters 8 through 12 now, a sense of coming to himself, perhaps accepting where he is in life. We have the privilege today, some of the teens that are here, they are on the early spectrum of life. Some of us are on the latter spectrum of life, and we're not sure where the needle is. Is it on empty or is it on full? For them, it's on full. For us, it might be nearer empty than any of us want to imagine. Now, here is the conclusion then of Solomon and his writing. As he looks back on life and his observation in his old age, is vanity of vanities was his conclusion. And so I'm going to move forward with this. Just a reminder, when you study Proverbs, he's a young father. When you study Ecclesiastes, he's an old father. You might even say he had turned into an old geezer. He was just his early chapters were very negative, very, very much not encouraging. I've sometimes joked with you, when you leave the class, you probably feel like you need to go for counseling, because you don't turn to the book of Proverbs to be encouraged in the early chapters. You really turn there to be rebuked and make sure that we don't follow the pattern of Solomon. So, with that said, in Ecclesiastes chapter 1, it's been a long time, but I wanted to remind you, we started off with 4 principles that you could follow to jumpstart your life. And so we were in the new year. Ecclesiastes chapter 1, and I'm not going to read the verses, but verse 3, a person's outlook affects their sense of happiness. What are some expressions that we might use to kind of picture people that look at life in a negative way versus people that look at life in a positive way? Any of you think of expressions? Huh? Negative feeling? What did he say?
Negative nilly.
Oh, negative nilly. You know, if you were up closer to the front, I probably could hear you, Rob, but that's all right. That's all right. You can stay in the darkness of the shadows back there. Negative nilly. Another would be a glass that's what? Half empty, or a glass that's half full. Some of us go through life and we're looking at a half full glass and there's hope. Some of us are going through life and we're looking at a half empty glass. Anyone else? I haven't heard negative nilly in ages. Boy, you must have been up in the hills for a while this past week. No. All right, here's the second one. A life apart from God is never truly satisfied. When Solomon was writing verses 8 through 11, he was living apart from the Lord, and he felt very much like an empty vessel, and you might remember that study back there. And then a third one, your perspective on life is not defined by your age, but by your spiritual perspective. When we look at life, if you're young, if some of you that are older were to talk to these young people, you would say you have what? Your whole life before you. The world is full of possibilities. Boy, you can just really dream big. So what do you tell to somebody that's our age? Your life is over. Your dreams are a nightmare. Just forgive it. Forget it. Somebody said, go home and die. That's kind of like the concept sometimes that you have with people. Over the years, I've known elderly people that even right up to the time of their death, they had a joy to them. I've often used in here a few times Georgia Finney, and some of you would have known Georgia. Georgia really was a widow lady. She had no children. Her daughter had died tragically when she was really, I guess, early 20s. And so she had lived out her life in a very kind way, but she was always joyful when you were around her. She really didn't have 2 nickels to rub together. In fact, some of the men at the church here ended up putting a roof on her house because she simply didn't have the money to do that, things like that. And so she had very little. But she was very much like a queen. When she died, Sheila and I went up to visit her. I've told you this. And we knew she was dying. She could die within that, in fact, within the next 24 hours, I think she did die. And Sheila and I go up to visit her. And she says, where are the children? Well, we left them in the lobby because you don't want to bring children up to, the bedside of someone who is dying. And she says, no, I want to see the children. And so one of us went back to the lobby to get the kids and bring them up because she wanted to see them. But the joy of that was she wanted to bless them. She wanted to greet them in love. And so there's perspectives on how to live life. And we can live life with a desire to be a blessing to others, or we can live life with a desire that we are just going to be depressed and unhappy and really just see no hope at all. When if we are God's people, we've got the hope of eternity and we have the hope of heaven. Anybody want to add to that before I move on? No? All right, let's go to another one. Dwelling on the past can diminish your joy and enthusiasm for life. Ecclesiastes, again, chapter 1, 15 through 18. If I had time to go through it, we could go back, but we don't need to. We have a lot to cover today. But just think about that, dwelling on the past. When we look at the past, we might look at the past with what? Regrets, with sorrows, with opportunities that passed us by. Look at the past and we wish that things were different. And when we do that, instead of looking at the moment and being blessed or looking to the future and having hope, we lose our joy and we lose our enthusiasm for life. And so we can cherish memories, but we have no reason to dwell on the failures, especially if we've made things right with the Lord and we've made things right with others. Anyone else want to comment before I move on? No? All right, let's go. Ecclesiastes 12 is where we're going to go. Just a reminder, how did Solomon get to be where he was? And we read this in 1 Kings 11 and verse 4. And it came to pass when Solomon was old. You say, how old? I don't know how old, but he's old. My wife and I sometimes have a discussion about what it means to be old. Do you ever have that discussion? You know, are you old? And it's a real shock to you when somebody says, you're old, right? You're old. Especially my lovely wife will do that sometimes. And you got any comments, or do I keep moving?
I think we're both still figuring out what old means.
Yeah. We could ask Victor, but he's younger than we are, so I don't know what we're going to do with that. But anyway, but look at how he got to be where he is. Not chronologically, but spiritually. His heart was not perfect with the Lord his God. The word perfect is to be whole, to be complete. We could say to be given over completely. And it draws a contrast in this verse. Solomon's heart was not perfect with the Lord. However, as was the heart of his father David. And we said, now wait a minute. David wasn't a perfect man. David was a man that adulterer. David was a man that had taken another man's life. But the overall testimony of David's life was what? That he was a man after God's own heart. So Solomon comes to the end of his life, and we find he was old. But as we come to Ecclesiastes chapter 11, or 12 rather, we have a different point of view because his spirit and his attitude had changed. So here's a thought then for your outline. How you see your Creator influences your outlook on life. When we look at God, we should see the one who made us, the one who has guided us, the one whose desire for us is only good and not evil, a God who is gracious and a God who is merciful. And so when we look at our life and we look back on life, we might see our failures, but certainly we ought to have a reason to give thanks to God for the blessings that He's given us. We used to sing, don't sing it that often now, but the song, Count Your Blessings, name them one by one, count your blessings and see what God has done. And I think sometimes we forget to stop and count our blessings. And we could take time to do that, but I'm going to move on. All right, so let's go through the verses, Ecclesiastes 12 and verse 1, and we're only going to cover 5 of the verses today. So on your outline, I think I have the verse written out there. So here we go. Ecclesiastes 12, verse 1 begins with the word, remember now, or recollect. Remember now thy Creator in the days of thy youth, while the evil days come not, nor the years draw nigh, when thou shalt say, I have no pleasure in them. So let's pause and think about that. Who is Solomon writing to now, or who is he teaching? He's not talking to the old people, he's talking to the young people. And his challenge to them is recollect, remember now, make a priority in your walk, in your relationship with God. So let me give you a thought to go on this. The first is this: enjoy life while you're young, but remember that God is sovereign. God is sovereign. He's never less than sovereign of our life. So remember now thy Creator in the days of thy youth. Here's a question for you. Why youth? What is different about young people, and we have a few in here, versus old people? What's the difference in the young people and the old people? Now, surely you can answer that question. Anybody?
They have more energy.
Huh?
They have more energy.
They have more energy. That's a good one. What's another difference in the young people and the old people? Huh? Wisdom. The young people have wisdom? Not usually. The old people have wisdom. So we have a lifetime of what? Experiences that they don't have. There's some things in life you can't teach. There are some things in life that you must learn. Also, you're a wise young person if you learn from the mistakes of others. If you have siblings and you've seen them get punished for something, learn from their mistakes, right? And don't follow in that pattern. When it didn't work for your brother or your sister, what makes you think it's going to work for you? That's a good thought and outline there. Let me add to that another thought. Remember the one then who formed you when you were in your mother's womb. We probably all have things about us that we wish that we could change. We wish we could change maybe the size of our nose, or we wish that we could change the color of our hair, or we wish that we had hair. We might wish that we were an athlete. We might wish that we had artistic talent, or we might wish that there are so many things that we might wish that we had. In fact, if you have your Bible, turn just for a moment to Psalm 139. Psalm 139. And I wanted to go through that. I didn't put it on the PowerPoint, but Psalm 139, and I believe this was penned by David. We read in Psalm 139 in verse 13, Thou hast possessed my reins, figuratively my soul, my heart. Thou hast covered me in my mother's womb. So speaking of that baby forming in a mother's womb. Verse 14, And I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made, amazingly made. Marvelous are thy works, and that my soul knoweth right well. My substance, that is my very being physically, was not hid from thee when I was made in secret in my mother's womb, and curiously wrought in the lowest part of the earth. The word curiously wrought is like a tapestry. If you've seen a tapestry, you have a tapestry, and the different threads that are woven in that tapestry that bring forth the design or the picture of its creator. In verse 16, Thine eyes did see my substance, that is my very body, my frame, yet being unperfect, or an embryo, an unformed mass of my mother's womb. And in thy book, thy letter, thy scroll, all my members were written. We could have on each of our lives designed by God. And like none other. There's no one else like you. You are unique in all the world. So remember thy Creator in thy youth, because there's no one else like you. And your life and your very being is a testimony of God's greatness. And so we continue to read in verse 16 again, that my parts were fashioned when as yet there were none, not at the first of them. And then verse 17, How precious also are thy thoughts unto me, O God, how great is the sum of them. Think about that. The God that created you, as his aspiration is that he might bestow upon you his goodness, his blessings, and his grace. Now, we can choose other things. We can choose to disobey him. But when we choose God, we choose the place of his blessing. Let me add to that then. Remember now the Creator in the days of thy youth, while the evil days come not, nor the years draw nigh, when thou shalt say, I have no pleasure in them. So it's kind of interesting. In the beginning of the verse, remember the Creator in the days of your youth, and then the comment, while the evil days come not. I've heard many over the years say, no one told me how hard it was going to be when I got old. And there's sometimes, I don't know if you are like this, but certain things in life, mom and dad are still alive, and I'll call them up and I want to find out what their health is. I don't know if you've done that, but one of the blessings of knowing the health of your father and your mother and your grandparents is that you kind of have an idea of what's in store for you as you grow older. Did they have arthritis? Did they have a bad back? Did they, whatever their ailments were. And sometimes you find out things about your family you had no clue, but they start showing up in your life, and you wonder, why in the world didn't somebody warn me about this? And of course, they probably did, and you weren't listening. Let me go to the next verses 2 through 7. And our young people here, they can get an idea of what it's like to get old. All right, so beginning in verse 2 through 7, we have the signs and the calamities of old age. Now, some of these I find very intriguing, and so as I worked through them, I thoroughly enjoyed it. So let's look at Ecclesiastes 12, verse 2. We're looking at the physical challenges of getting old or of aging. So look at verse 2. Now, he says, remember the Creator in the days of thy youth. Then he says, while the evil days come not, speaking of getting old. And then he writes in verse 2, while the sun or the light or the moon or the stars be not darkened. That is, that they don't grow dim, they don't become dark. Nor the clouds return after the rain. So let's begin with the first part here. What is it? We know that the sun's not going to go dim. We know that the moon's not going to grow dim. We know the stars are not going to go dim or be darkened. So what is it about getting old that causes the sun to be dimmer or the stars to be dimmer or darkened? What is it about getting old that happens, Mark? Your eyesight. So what Solomon is talking about is your eyes. Your eyes fail. Glaucoma, cataracts, I don't know what else we could toss out there, but there are things that happen as we get older. You go for your eye exam. For a long time, my eyes have really remained unchanged. I need glasses. This last time I kept noticing, man, I'm not seeing as well in one eye. And so I go, have my eyes checked, and say, well, this one is a little bit weaker. You got to get a stronger prescription. And then the fatal word that begins with the letter C. Cataracts are forming. And so, man, how long am I going to have to live with this? Well, I'll let you know when we need to do that. So one of the things of old age, fortunately, having cataracts removed now, I think has almost become routine. Let me go to the third one, all right? This one is a little bit more of a challenge, so let's figure it out. Ecclesiastes 12, verse 3. In the days when the keepers of the house shall tremble. Now, we're talking about being old, all right? The strong men shall bow themselves. The grinders cease because they are few. And those that look out of the windows be darkened. So we really have four ailments of getting old that are recorded in this particular verse. So let's start with the first one. When the keepers of the house shall tremble. What does that mean? Huh? Yeah. You're getting older, and guess what? The body trembles. Now, put your hand out in front of you, and does it stay steady, or is it going like that, right? There's things like that happen as we get older. And they may come along and diagnose it and say that you've got Parkinson's or you've got nerve damage or whatever it might be. This keeper of the house is really the hands. You work with your hands. You work with your hands around the house. And as you get older, the tendency is that they will tremble. I've seen that with, particularly with my dad when I'm at home. Dad's 92. He'll turn 92 this year. And I can see his hand tremble some. And said, well, that's getting old. Well, yeah, it is getting old. It might be loss of muscles, weaker muscles, this thing of getting older. Well, let's go to the next one. So we're going to move on. So we've got the keepers of the house tremble. The strong men shall bow themselves. So that's kind of being stooped over, right? Maybe walking with a cane is the thought there. Now, what is this next one? And the grinders cease because they are few. What is that? Your teeth. The teeth, tooth decay, I could put up there. But as you get older, the responsibility of looking after your teeth increases, as well as does the expense of doing so. Some of us are there and some are not, right? But your teeth decay. The grinders cease because they're few. I've recently had to visit the dentist a lot more than I have in the past. And so you go in. I never have liked dentists. That is the one profession I do not know why you go into that profession unless it's simply to just torture people. So I go in, and the hygienist, working on my teeth, and said something about you must be off work. I said, actually, I left the office to come here. I said, I just finished studying the verse, the grinders cease because they are few. And she said, well, that's got to be your molars. And I thought, that's pretty good. She got it immediately. And so another sign of old age, the body's trembling, the teeth are decaying. By the way, there's no way to get around this, right, other than doing what you can to stay healthy. And even then, you're fighting a losing battle. Here's another one. Your eyes once sparkled with life. So we look, the teeth are few, and those that look out the windows be darkened. The idea of being darkened is simply the thought that you've lost the sparkle of life or the youthfulness of life. You don't have the bright outlook on life itself. One of the great joys of having a school here is 190 children that come in. And they bring an energy with them. I think that's one of the reasons I enjoy working with teenagers over the years was there was a joy of being with them, a joy of being with youth. So most of us can think about when our children were young, pliable, controllable, and they brought with it burdens, but they brought a lot of joy. Do you remember the laughter of your children when they were in another part of the house? Do you remember when it got really quiet and you knew you better go and see what they're up to because they're probably... we got this wonderful picture of our two granddaughters. One is, what, 2?
They're 2, she's 2, and the other's 1.
2 and 1 years old. They got into Mom's lipstick. And boy, they had lipstick all over their faces, all over their arms, all over the sofa. I mean, lipstick was everywhere. So you've got the joy of youth as well as some of the challenges of it. Here's another, the melancholy associated with aging. Now, this is particularly a great challenge. So let's go through this verse here. And the doors shall be shut in the streets, when the sound of the grinding is low, and he shall rise up at the voice of the bird. What kind of bird wakes you up? The rooster, right? And all the daughters of music shall be brought low. So let's begin with the first thought. And the doors shall be shut in the streets. You know what that's talking about? It's talking about loneliness. Loneliness. No one's coming to visit. No one's stopping by your house. No one's having fellowship. The doors of the street are shut. Now let's look at the next one. The sound of the grinding is low. Now we talked about losing your teeth. This one's talking about losing your what? Losing your hearing. Losing your hearing is talking about deafness. So the melancholy of old age, the doors are shut, loneliness. The sound of the grinding is low. They're still grinding flour, grain, but you can hardly hear it. But they're still grinding it. Many of us might be at the point in life the TV's getting louder and louder. It's not because the sound is quieter and quieter. It's just that the hearing's not what it used to be. Let's look at the next one. And then he shall rise up at the voice of the bird. Now, roosters can tend to crow not just at sun up. They can tend to crow well before sun up, right? This is talking about trouble sleeping. It's interesting. You can be losing your hearing, and yet you can't go to sleep. You would think that if you can't hear anything, you ought to be able to sleep. Well, trouble sleeping. And then think about the last one. I'll give you my interpretation. But here it says, and all the daughters of music shall be brought low. What do daughters bring with them? If you have a daughter, what does a daughter bring? What kind of music? It's not literal, it doesn't necessarily mean literal music, but it means the sound of their voices. The joyful voices of daughters fall silent. So we're back to the loneliness again. And Jay, I'm not trying to make you depressed. Both of your daughters are gone at the same time. But so the melancholy associated with aging. Let me move on. I wanted to cover verse 5 and it will be finished. And then here's one. Let's see if you can get this one. The fears associated with old age. You have your outline there. Let me read. Also, when they shall be afraid, it's talking about the old folks, when they shall be afraid of that which is high, and fears shall be in the way, the almond tree shall flourish, the grasshopper shall be a burden, and desire shall fail, because man goeth to his long home, and the mourners go about in the street. So let's begin with the first part, all right? So the first part reads, also when they shall be afraid of that which is high. So if we're talking about the elderly, what are the elderly afraid of? Huh? All right, afraid of heights. They're afraid of heights and falling, right? As you get older, today we have the marvel of surgery. You can replace a hip, you can repair a femur, but if you had lived 100 years ago, you would find a fall would be the beginning of the end, right? And so typically the older people are going to be afraid of that which is high. And then it goes on, it says, and fears shall be in the way. So the fear of what? The fear of heights is one. I'm going to suggest to you also the fear of not only falling, but the vulnerability of falling. As we get older, especially as men, we want to think that we can fight and defend ourselves like we could when we were 20 or 30 or 40 years old. But when you're older and you're living in a society that's more and more violent, the reality is that as you get older, you're more vulnerable. That's why I encourage older folks to carry canes with them. For one, when you see somebody walking with a cane, you usually give them a wider berth, right? You teach your children, don't go up close to them. Plus, with a cane, you could beat somebody to death if you had to, right? All right, moving on. That's not in that verse there. I thought I'd just add it. All right, here's another then. The latter part, we have 4 more things that are found here. All right, so we've got the almond trees shall flourish, the grasshopper shall be a burden, desire shall fail, because man goeth to his long home, and the mourners go about the streets. So let's begin with the almond tree shall flourish. Do you know what color the blossoms of an almond tree are? They are white. So what are we talking about? Graying hair. So Solomon, again, he's talking about getting old and what's associated with it. Graying hair. The almond tree shall flourish. And then the grasshopper shall be a burden. Now, grasshoppers usually around my house are killed upon the first glimpse. Right? You don't want to be a grasshopper anywhere near my home. Otherwise, a woman I accuse of being paranoid is all over killing them. In fact, we have, 4 cans of spray at just the right places to kill the grasshopper. For me, I'll just step on them if I want to. Anyway, the grasshopper shall be a burden. What is that talking about? It's really talking about the failure of physical strength. The grasshopper in and of itself is not a burden, but the grasshopper is thought of in this sense as Solomon's painting the picture of losing your physical strength. And then we go to desire shall fail. Now, this could be a different kind of appetite. It could be an appetite about food. It could be sexual desire. Different desires could be here. One of the things I've learned as you get older is that you eat less and you still gain weight. There's something very much unfair about that. I may be the only one in here that has that problem. But I tell Sheila, I'm eating less than I ever have, and I still can't lose weight. What is wrong with this picture? And then she said, well, your mother used to complain about the same thing, which didn't help me at all. But anyway, the appetite fails, and we won't go into any more than that because we have a mixed audience. And then let's go to the last part. Because man goeth to his long home, where does the old man go when he's dying or when he's dead? He's going to his long home. And so who shows up? Mourners. Mourners gather doing what? Anticipating the old man's death. One of the other things that follows the mourners anticipating the old man's death is the mourners anticipating the old man's wealth, his inheritance. And so we're in this room here, we're old enough to be very much conscious of that. I have seen that so many times over the years.